Welcome back. Now we're looking at Western art in the 1800s, Part 2. First up, The Valley of Mexico from the Hillside of Santa Isabel by Jose Maria Velasco. This is oil on canvas, and it's actually quite large. Now, this painting is just full of references to Mexican heritage. In fact, Mexican nationalism is at an all time high at this point. We're about to enter a phase in Mexican history of about 60 years of revolutionary activity in which European leadership is actually thrown out and you have self rule by Mexico. It's interesting because Velasco is one of the best known landscape painters, but he is a professionally trained painter, which is odd for this time period, but also his influences are very European. However, he uses Mexican landscapes and symbolism to express his own patriotism and Mexican independence. Now, the setting is just outside of Mexico City. You can actually see it in the background. And you have these two mountains that have a strong history in Aztec lore. Check out the two figures in the foreground. They are very clearly in Mexican indigenous dress, and they inhabit a scene that is very indicative of Mexican history and is well known throughout Mexico. Some of the aspects of the scene itself indicate a work that we've seen in the past. In the background, you see a shrinking Lake Texcoco and the growing Mexico City, also Tepeyac Hill. And if you remember Juan Diego and his vision of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the basilica that houses the cape that is known as Our Lady of Guadalupe is actually in the background as well. Up next, the Houses of Parliament, the Palace of Westminster in London. This is where Parliament meets. It is a symbol of England. It also has some really interesting artistic symbolism. It avoids the neoclassicism that was generally symbolic of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. It also embraces a neo Gothic style, which is very much British nationalism because Britain is associated heavily with the Gothic style. And the Gothic period of architecture is, in fact, when British parliamentary government actually began. Now we're on to Impressionism. Here's Claude Monet's The Impression Sunrise. It's literally a slice of life. This is what Monet saw. It was his impression of a given moment. And these impressionist artists oftentimes painted in the environment. That was what was necessary to get that impression of moment. Edouard Manet actually painted Monet in his boat studio. Impressionist artists oftentimes embraced common themes, common subjects. You see this with Renoir's painting here. Notice the blurry outlines, the sense of movement. Also, notice too the viewer does not have a clear picture of what's going on. We see early examples of these scenes of life with Peter Bruegel, with the peasant wedding, also with his hunters in the snow. The difference is that these scenes do not look alive. There isn't clear movement. And that actually gives us a bit of a sense of stagnation. This is also seen in the Marode altarpiece, if you remember that. Naturalism and perspective, it's a lifeless scene. These images, these figures, are not truly alive. They look realistic, but they're not alive as we think of Impressionism as showing life, things that are happening in the moment. Um, the way Impressionist artists do this is they blur the lines in order to give the viewer a sense of the scene actually happening. Monet's Saint Lazare Station is a great example of Impressionist work. The station itself had a glass roof, and Monet went there in order to get the play of light off of the roof and smoke and the gritty atmosphere of this modern setting. It's not a really beautiful place, but it is representative of modern life, something that was extremely common in Paris at the time. Before we get into the post Impressionists, we have to look at Japanese influences on European art. Japanese influences are becoming very substantial at this time, mainly because of increased European contact with the region. Now, ukiyo-e is a type of art during the Tokugawa era, and the Tokugawa era, as we know, was extremely isolated. This is a time where Japanese Japanese society was stagnated, and a floating world existed in Japan. This floating world consisted of places where those social stigmas and those social roles really were just removed and people could be themselves. Japan was well known for its woodblock printing, and a prime example of this is Hokusai's Great Wave off Kanagawa. Also, it's part of something called 36 Views of Mount Fuji. What I'd like you to notice is not just the color is important, but also the awkward scenes. The scenes themselves are unexpected. The scenes are not what you would traditionally see in European art. Japanese art itself was not dominated by European canon. It was not subject to the same type of rules that Europeans had embraced. These images are oftentimes very incomplete with really substantial images at the foreground, but those substantial images oftentimes are not the most important things in the scenes themselves. This was really influential. Western artists, including Van Gogh, are imitating Japanese styles. Here you see some examples of this. Another artist that imitated Japanese style was Marie Cassette and the Coiffure. She's an American artist who spends most of her time in Paris, and this is really an homage to Japanese styles. Perhaps the most well-known post-impressionist artist is Vincent van Gogh, and all of you have seen Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. This post-impressionist work uses thick impasto paint. You have a very energetic sky. You have the church spire in town, but it's dominated by this cypress tree that, in a way, connects the heavens and earth. The cypress tree was also a symbol in European history of graveyards and mourning, and this is sort of a mournful type of image itself. Van Gogh's work is now well appreciated, but remember at the time, these post-impressionist artists were not appreciated by other what were considered professional artists, and these works were rather controversial. With Paul Cézanne, we can see the evolution of artist styles and how these influences change what he actually produces over the years. One of his most famous subjects is Mount Saint Victoire. It shows up in many of his paintings throughout the years. And what I want you to note on the following images: look at what's in the foreground, look at perception, look at depth, and watch how his style changes. This is from 1876, 77. We're going to move into his next painting, which still has Mount Victoire in the background. This one is from 1882 to 1885. Notice the prominent image has changed. Mount Saint Victoire is still there, but his view changes. Now we're on to 1887. The prominent image is incomplete, much like Japanese painting. This is very common in the era. As time progresses, so too does his style. This is 1890. The next image will be extremely important when it comes to influencing abstract artists later in the 20th century. The shapes are very simplified. And in some ways, this can be a precursor, because of its use of multiple vantage points for the same object, it can be a precursor to Cubism. Sculpture also changed during the era. You guys are all familiar with this guy Rodin and his sculpture, The Thinker. We're going to look through a few of his images really quickly so you can get a sense of what this man accomplished and how he changed artistic styles. He is a classically trained artist who specialized in Renaissance styles. However, his individualism and the changes he made were quite important when it came to sculpture and when it came to what actually art is as we move into the 20th century. This work, The Burghers of Calais, was meant to memorialize some heroic figures from the city of Calais. A burgher simply is a town leader. Now, the city of Calais was under siege by the English. They ordered some burghers to be sent as captives in order to lift the siege. These burghers thought, of course, they would be executed. They actually weren't. But the image that he created is one of despair, is one of sadness and heartache. The figures themselves are elongated. The people of Calais, when this was presented to them, were not impressed at all, and they were thinking something much more heroic, something much more indicative of what they believed their city's history was. But I think Rodin captured something that was much more realistic of how the individuals involved would have felt in that moment. There's a 3D model of this work available online. I think it's well worth checking out. By using that, you can really see the individualized features of each figure within the work itself. Moving forward, note how quickly styles are changing. Here's one of the more famous works in art history. It's The Scream by Edvard Munch. The sky is this crazy, almost unrealistic color. For Munch, this is a nightmare. It's a portrayal of sound and emotion, and it's a rejection of these natural details that we've seen in the past. The figure itself resembles a Peruvian mummy, which these Peruvian mummies were being discovered. It's almost like a primal scream, I believe, is how it's been described in the past. We're wrapping things up today with Paul Gauguin and his work that is really inspired by his time in the South Pacific. It's called Where Do We Come From? Where Are We? Where Are We Going? And it is designed as a fresco style, and it actually reads from right to left. It's a rather large painting, which you can see in this image, that almost tells the cycle of life. It has a lot of odd imagery in it, and one thing that we have that we don't have from a lot of other artists is Gauguin's actual description of what this means, what he was intending, the things that he has added in. Now, the individual scenes are pretty clear. Here is where we came from, almost a prehistoric type scene. Next is where we are, and maybe this is the idea of the Garden of Eden, perhaps. We definitely see someone picking fruit there. And finally, where we're going. Notice the idol in the background. Is it the afterlife? The old woman herself? Is she near death? What's funny, too, is he adds in the actual title at the top. Where do we come from, where we are, and where we're going. Here's the Carson Peary Scott and Company building in Chicago, Illinois. I'll just let you guys read about this for now as I wrap this up. Coming up in the future, we're going to take a look at some of the more modern art from the 20th century. Things are going to change drastically. Really interesting works coming up. I hope you join me for that.